Okay, let's get into this. Today, we're doing a deep dive into a really unsettling case, the one that gave its perpetrator that chilling nickname, the Hammer Killer of Frankfurt.
That's right. We've got a collection of sources here, articles, some research data, reports.
And our job, really, is to sift through all this information, pull out the key details, and help you understand the timeline, the context, and just the disturbing facts of the Arthur Gatter case as these documents present them.
We're focusing specifically on Frankfurt, West Germany in 1990. That's the time frame these sources cover, detailing the events based on the information available then.
So let's start with Arthur Gatter himself. Who was he, according to these
Well,
sources?
the basics are born 1940 in Ravensburg, Germany. He died December 12th, 1990 in Gießen. So he was, what, 49 or 50?
Quite young, really. And his profession?
He was trained as an electrician. The sources mentioned he actually spent some time in Australia, then came back to Germany, did assembly work for a while.
But then things took a turn. The documents talk about a pretty significant decline.
They do. It seems he stopped working sometime in the 1980s.
Hmm.
There's even a detail about him basically wrecking his apartment on Wilhelm Leuschner Strasse.
And the sources connect this to his mental health, right? They suggest his schizophrenia was, and this is a quote, greatly advanced by the time he stopped working.
Exactly. It wasn't just, odd behavior. The material points to serious mental health issues, leading to him acting suspiciously in his next place in Bornheim, and eventually being examined at a psychiatric clinic in Haina.
So this context, this state of mind described in the sources, is important leading into 1990.
Definitely. And to understand the crimes, you also need to understand the setting, Frankfurt, 1990, as laid out in our material.
The attacks themselves happened between February 1st and May 22nd, mostly on the outskirts of the city. Is that right?
Largely, yes. And the sources give us a crucial piece of context here about the city at that time.
Which is?
Frankfurt had a large homeless population back then. The figure mentioned is around 2,400 people staying in the city, often in parks and green areas.
Which, of course, highlights just how vulnerable many of the potential victims were, sleeping outdoors. It's a key detail from the sources.
And this series of attacks, this spree, it happened alarmingly fast, just under 4 months. Should we walk through the timeline as the sources detail it?
Yeah, let's trace that. The first crime scene discovery mentioned is February 2nd, 1990.
Right, 5:00 a.m.
Mhm.
A security guard found Hans-Peter S., known as Peterchen, who is 43 and homeless.
Then just 5 days later, February 7th, Kurt Helmut H., only 22, found with fatal head injuries.
And the sources note something interesting here. He wasn't homeless, which apparently made it harder initially for police to connect his death to the first one.
Okay, then the timeline in the material shows a bit of a gap until April 2nd.
Yes, a homeless man, Helmut R., discovered at a bus stop, Recklingrabenstrasse, about 5:40 a.m. Severe head injuries. He died from them.
The very next day, April 3rd, the sources say 2 more victims were killed near the Eschenheimer plant. Things were escalating quickly.
They were. And then April 9th, another Helmut R., different person. The sources specify murdered in Aussale.
Then we move into May. May 4th, Hans Peter M., 46 years old, found around 7:30 in the morning.
And the very next day, May 5th, is particularly grim. 2 victims, Engelbert G60 and Nicola Z, 42, found dead only about 50 meters apart.
And the sources really emphasize this point, including the victim for May 4th. That's 3 homeless people murdered in just 24 hours. It really drives home the pattern described in the documents.
It does. Now, the timeline also includes an entry for May 20th, mentioning a Brazilian man, Anderson S., following someone into a bush.
Okay, and how does that fit in?
Well, it's included in the source's timeline of events during that period, but material we have doesn't explicitly link Anderson S. as a victim of Gatter's hammer attacks or detail the outcome fully. It's just sort of noted as happening then.
Got it. So perhaps relevant context, but not confirmed as part of the main spree based on these documents. Which brings us to the last victim mentioned.
Heinrich O., May 22nd, 1990. And this is the crucial date.
Because this time, someone saw it happen. A local resident witnessed the attack and called the police straight away.
Exactly. And according to the sources, that witness report led directly to Arthur Gatter's arrest just incredibly 12 minutes later.
So summing up the grim tally from the sources, Gatter is linked to a total of 8 deaths in this period.
8 people killed in just over 3 months. And the way he did it, as described in the sources, is deeply disturbing.
He specifically targeted people sleeping on park benches.
Systematically. He'd surprise them while they were asleep, completely vulnerable. The material mentions he would actually watch them for a bit first.
Until he was sure he could, quote, do his job safely. That's chilling. There's also a detail about him using low-noise rubber gloves.
Right, for stealth.
That too.
And the violence itself, extreme. The sources state he hit with such force that, quote, the blood splashed meter wide.
Which directly ties into the hammer killer name. The weapon was indeed a hammer.
A metalwork hammer, yes. The sources say it was found when he was arrested, hidden in a plastic bag under his arm.
And forensics.
Forensics confirmed it. The hammer caused what they called typical impression fractures or perforated structures in the skull. Basically crushing or puncture wounds consistent with heavy hammer blows.
So, faced with this escalating series of brutal attacks, how did the police respond?
Well, after the 2 deaths on April 3rd, they ramped things up significantly.
Oh.
The sources tell us they formed a special task force, Operation Berber, led by Commissioner Karl-Heinz Wagner.
What kind of tactics did they try? The material mentions a few things.
Yeah, some were quite creative, I suppose. They put mannequins, dolls on park benches as bait.
And used plainclothes officers as decoys, too, right? Trying to pose as potential victims.
Exactly. They also tried technology installing hidden cameras in birdhouses in the parks.
Did that work?
No, apparently not. The sources mention issues like diffused parking lights and simply inadequate camera technology at the time. It wasn't enough.
They also chipped dry cleaners.
Looking for anyone bringing in blood-stained clothes. But that didn't lead anywhere either, according to the documents.
You can only imagine the fear in the city, especially among the homeless population.
Absolutely. And the city did react. The sources note they opened up more shelters and even kept subway stations open overnight, trying to give people safer places to sleep than park benches.
There was also that incident on April 11th mentioned in the sources. A homeless man reported seeing someone approach a sleeping person with some kind of blunt object.
Right, that led to a composite sketch and even an arrest of a suspect in the Gallus district. But he was eventually released. No evidence linking him to these crimes as detailed here. It shows how tough the investigation was.
Until that witness report on May 22nd broke the case open, leading to Gatter's arrest.
That was the turning point.
And what happened after the arrest? Legally, medically?
Well, the documentation indicates a psychiatric report was done. And it concluded he qualified for an insanity defense.
Meaning the assessment was that his mental illness, his schizophrenia, was so severe he might not have understood his actions were wrong.
Essentially, yes. That's the implication of that finding as presented in the sources. But he never actually went to trial.
Why not?
He died before the court process could finish. The sources state Arthur Gatter killed himself. He hanged himself using a gauze bandage in custody on December 12, 1990.
So if we look back at this deep dive, drawing just from these sources, we see this picture of Arthur Gatter, his documented mental health decline, this incredibly rapid and brutal series of attacks focused on vulnerable people in Frankfurt's parks.
We see the specific, horrifying method, the hammer, the element of surprise against sleeping victims, and we also see the police investigation, the challenges they faced, the tactics they tried, and how it ultimately ended with that crucial witness account.
Yeah, the sources really lay out the chilling effectiveness of his method against people who were completely defenseless in their sleep.
It highlights a terrifying vulnerability, exploiting that lack of safe shelter for so many and posing, unique problems for the police trying to stop him.
It definitely leaves you thinking, based purely on what these documents describe. What does a case like this reveal about that difficult intersection between severe, perhaps untreated, mental illness and public safety, especially when it impacts those already living on the margins without secure housing? It's a heavy question embedded in the facts presented by these sources.